Okay, so now we're going to talk about some more intermediate functionality of Excel, and we'll start with pivot tables, and then we'll just kind of briefly touch on what macros are and how they work. So let's go over here. I've created this pivot data. Let me take these out real quick, and we'll put them back in a sec. So this is 20 dates for a fictitious company, showing their sales and gross sales, and each of these dates then are broken into 4 categories, A through D, and so there's a total of 80 entries. And when you're looking at data like this, this is a really good kind of basic example for why pivot tables are useful. Because here we can view this by date or by category or by any combination of the two. And so when we're breaking down sales and gross sales, we kind of want a way to be able to just quickly and easily move things around and look at things in different ways. And so one way we could do that is to highlight the labels here and pop it a filter. And that anytime I change a filter for any of these labels, it's going to rearrange all this data together. It's going to expand the selection all the way across. So like in this case, if I click category here and I turn them all off and then just select, say, A or something, and then I say OK, then we're just going to see category A, which is kind of handy. But it's still considerably more cumbersome than using a pivot table. Plus, there's more things you can do with a pivot table. So first let's select all our data from the labels down, and then we'll go up here to the insert option, tab I should say, and then click on pivot table, and then we're going to put in an existing worksheet, and so we'll just select a single cell for our top left corner and then say OK. And so there's our pivot table, and notice that while we're clicked anywhere inside of this pivot table, we've got these buttons here, and then we've also got our pivot table tools up here with these 2 new tabs. And so the pivot table field list is pretty important. You're going to need that to place things into the pivot table and move things around inside of it. And so if this button controls the field list, if it's ever turned off and you click onto your pivot table, you'll notice the pivot table tools pop up, but we don't see the field list. So don't get discouraged, just remember that you need to turn it back on. Okay, so we've got our four labels here are in our field list, and so these are just obviously our 4 fields here, and we can put them anywhere we want in any of these 4 boxes. And so the report filter is just very similar to these filters here. It's not going to really put a lot of data into your pivot table, but rather just kind of change the way data is viewed. But then we have our labels here, row labels along the side, and then column labels along the top, and then values. And so we'll start by putting in a row label. We're just going to grab date here and just drag it down into this box. And so as you can see, it only with the labels, row labels or column labels, it's only going to show us unique values. So we actually have 80 entries, but there's 4 of each date repeated. So it's just going to find those unique values and sort of group everything on each one of those individual dates. And so we'll go ahead and just take sales and make that a value. So just grab it and drag it into this values box. And so what it's doing here, like I said, it's grouping on the dates. And so what it's going to do is it's going to sum the total for each of those dates for us automatically. That's the default for the values. As you can see over here in the values, it's telling us that it's summing it. And so we can actually change that, and we'll do that in a sec. But just to make sure that this is accurate, we can come over here, let's just look at date 1, and if we highlight all the sales for date 1, we can see that the sum should be $204, which it is here. And we can also make this currency just like with any other cells. You know, if we highlight it and then we come up here to the Home tab and change it from General to Currency. Now that we have this, we have it in the sum. So if we wanted to, we could click on this little drop-down arrow here and select Value Field Settings. And so in here it shows us all the ways we can summarize our values. So currently we're summarizing them by addition, by summing them all up. We can also do count, and if we did count, we would expect to see 4 in all of these because we have 4 entries for each date. And so if we do that, sure enough, and it's still in dollars because I changed it, but that's fine. And so we'll go back to our value field settings. We'll put it back on sum, but just note that there's several different things you could do here. And then you could also choose to show the values as percentages of different calculations and things like that. And so we'll leave it on the sum. And then let's come up here and let's say we can actually, if we put another value in here, if we take the gross and also add that in here, notice that it just places it right next to the existing data. And so with values, there's no layering that goes on. It just shows you the values you would expect to see based on the labels that you have in there. But if I were to take category and drag it down into my row labels, notice that it layers that. So it shows us, we have date on the top here and then category. So it's going to show everything by date first, and then it's going to show the breakdown of the categories within that date. And so if I wanted to, I could collapse this or open it back up. And so once we have it like this, one thing you'll notice is that the totals here, the subtotals are on the top, which is really bizarre. You know, you would expect, intuitively, you would always expect subtotals to be underneath the data. And also notice that the date labels don't have their own column. They're kind of all smashed in here together with the categories. And to me, I don't really like this layout. And so what I'm going to do is come up here to the design button, and I'm going to change the report layout up here. So currently it's in compact form, and I'm going to change it to tabular form. And so now all the subtotals are on the bottom, and all of the date labels are in their own column here to the left. And so if we wanted to go another step, if we don't, if you don't like these subtotals, you can come up here again in this design tab, and you can turn off your subtotals. We've also, we just turn those off. We've also got grand total down here at the bottom, which is pretty handy. But if for any reason you don't want it, you come up here and turn that off here as well. And then a lot of times you'll have blank data kind of in your pivot table. For instance, if you want to make a pivot table dynamic, when you're selecting your pivot table range, you might select a bunch of additional data at the bottom so that when data is added in the future, the pivot table can be refreshed and to contain the new data. So if that happens, if you've got dates, let's see, well, we'll come over here and just do that example. So in our options tab, we can change the data source here, and we'll talk about some of these other buttons in a sec. If we change the data source and just include, it goes to 82, so let's just include another 4 blank rows. So we'll go to 86 here, and I'm just going to manually change that and say OK. Now we've got this blank down here. And so if you've got a blank and you don't want to see it, you can come up here to your filter, and these filters are built in. You can also use your report filters, or you can come up here to any field and just click the drop down and filter it that way as well. But in this case, I'm just going to come up here to my drop down, and I don't want to see any of those blanks, so I'm going to come down here and find the blank and just turn it off. Okay, and that's one way you could do that. And notice it shows us now this little filter button just to show that we have that on there. And so let's go back and select them all again, and now our blank should be back down there. And so another way we could do that is to come in here and go to our label filters and say does not contain. And you have to use the contains field if there's not numerical values. With numerical values, you would use the equals or does not equal. So in this case, we'll say does not contain, and then we'll just type blank with the parentheses around it like we saw it down there and say OK. And so now again we have our report filter showing up, and if we scroll down, now the blank is gone. So that's just two different ways of doing that. And so back to our design tab, we can also change kind of the look and feel of the table. I'm just going to leave it like this, but just notice that there are a lot of different ways you can do it. And so now that we've kind of got that sorted, let's go back over here and look at some different ways we could view that data. So let's say I wanted to just look by category. I can just grab this date label and drag it off, and notice it shows an X icon down there now. And so if I release, it's just going to remove that. And it also reset our filter. And so now we would need to turn that blank field off again. And so now we've just got our totals for our categories. So that's pretty handy. We can come up here and filter it like we were doing earlier, but now when we filter to A, we'll just see that total automatically. And if we wanted to, we could put the dates back in there. So let's say we're going to filter by category on top and then by date. And so now, as you can see, we just see the A category like we were doing with our filter here earlier, with all of the individual dates, and then we could collapse that and get that same view that we just had with only the grand total there. And so there's several different ways of looking at things. And I'm just going to flip this back around the way it was before and take out those filters. And if you want, you can just come up here, go to your filter drop down, and just say clear filter, and that'll get rid of it for you. We'll clear both of those out. And so now that we've got all that, let's go back to our options here. And so there's a lot of different things we can do. First off, we have our pivot table name, which is important if you're ever getting into macros. You can reference a pivot table by its name here. And then another one that you're going to use a lot is this refresh button. And so with actual data, when you change something like for a formula, like if this were to say equals, well here, first let's just make a value. Let's just say 25 or something. And let's say equals L3 plus 5, right, which is 30. Now if I change this to 5, it's automatically going to change this over here to 10. But interestingly, if we look at this $20 here in the pivot table, if I change that to a 50, notice nothing happens over here. It still says 20. So the reason for that is that formulas in Excel are set to automatic recalculation by default. So anytime something changes, it'll recalculate everything that particular value affects. So if you go to formulas here in your tabs, you can change that with calculation options. So as you can see, currently it's set to automatic. We could make it manual, where nothing would ever recalculate until we use one of these buttons to tell it to do so. We'll leave it for automatic in this case. But with pivot tables, they are automatically set by default not to automatically recalculate. So we can make all the changes we want to this data. Nothing's going to happen to our pivot table unless we do one of two things. If we change the data source, we did that earlier and noticed that, I'm sure you noticed when we did that earlier, it made the blank automatically show up in our data. So if you change the data source, it is going to refresh it for you. Also, if we hit this refresh button, it's going to do the same thing. And so watch our sum of sales here when I hit the button. Notice it changed to $50. And so just keep that in mind. You don't want to change data thinking that you're changing your pivot table when it's really not. And then if you had a bunch of pivot tables in a single workbook, you could hit this drop down and refresh them all, which is also pretty nice. And then if you ever want to just get rid of a pivot table, just go to your select button and say entire pivot table, and it's going to select the whole thing. And if you just hit the delete button, it'll go away. So another one last thing I'll cover for pivot tables, in the insert tab, if you've never inserted a chart, you just go to your insert tab and go to this chart pane, and you can insert any chart you want. And normally you're going to highlight the data you want in the chart, then click the chart, then select the chart you want, and it'll fill it with that data. In the case of a pivot table, all you've got to do is click anywhere inside the pivot table, then choose your chart and click on it, and it's going to automatically put all your pivot data into the chart. And the really nice thing about this, currently what we're seeing is all of our sales and all of our gross sales, and kind of how they trend together, which is nice, but that can be a lot of data to look at once. And so with a pivot table, really nice thing is that the charts are actually dynamic. So if I make a change here, let's say I go to my date filter and turn them off, and then I just want to look at date 1. As you can see here, the chart changes along with the pivot data, and so now I'm just seeing the categorical breakdown for just that single date. And so that pretty much covers it for the basics for pivot tables, and in the next video we'll talk about macros.